Nissan bonus. That's up to $17,000 in total.
That's definitely a party.
Nissan's all-in clear-out event is on now. Until December 31st on approved credit. Conditions apply. Details at Nissan. Until December 23rd, the Caisse des Jardins Pierre Legardeur presents the l'Assomption Christmas Market. With over 70 exhibitors, find the best gift ideas and local products in a setting worthy of the great European Christmas markets. The l'Assomption Christmas Market.
At IGA, we help you save every week. Like on 454-gram compliment butter at $4.88. If you didn't receive your IGA flyer in the mail, check out our offers on the app or at IGA.net. Until Wednesday, December 11th, details at participating stores.
All right, Sunwing team, we survived Black Friday. Time to sit back, relax, and...
Well, there's still Cyber Monday.
What?
You know, our Cyber Monday deals. Plus our daily door crashers that change every morning at 9 a.m. so customers can take advantage of a new deal on a different resort or destination every day.
But we just...
Oh, yeah. You thought Black Friday was exciting? It's about to get real. Book Sunwing's Cyber Monday deals now at...
The holidays are filled with traditions.
Hey, let's have the tree. Dirtiest in the tub, everyone. The casserole is delish.
And this year,
We're going to be fun.
it's time for a new tradition. Visit the Hammock Quebec website to book your appointment for a blood drive.
How do you, Subway holiday lover?
I'm dreaming of a turkey sub.
Well, hold on to your chestnuts for Subway's new festive base meal. A 6-inch turkey sub with cranberry Dijon, crispy potato wings, and red velvet cookies.
Jingle my bell.
No, thank you. But all this delicious and fixins for just $8.99.
Maybe some sugar plum.
No idea what that is. The new festive babes meal. A merry $8.99. Only at Subway. At participating Canadian restaurants. Extras additional. Terms and conditions apply.
By the fireplace.
This winter, discover the electric vehicles with the most awards in Canada. The Hyundai Ioniq 5 and 6 and the Kona EV are all perfectly adapted to our Quebec winters and eligible for government rebates of up to $12,000. During Hyundai's I Love Winter event, finance an Ioniq 5 or 6 starting at 0.99%, including a loyalty rate reduction for eligible customers. Or lease an Ioniq 5 for $90 per week at 5.29%, including government rebates. Conditions apply. Visit HyundaiCanada.com for details.
Estoril Resort Perfect Gifts up to 50% off. Treat yourself to a spacious suite with fireplace, a rendezvous at the spa, restaurant, or wine cellar. Your exceptional destination in the Laurentians. Book at Estoril.com. Registered in accordance with the Tourism Accommodation Act.
Why do I love getting my holiday gifts at Pharma Free? The PC Optima points. Perfume for mom, points for me. Chocolates for the teachers, oh yeah, points for me. Pharma Free. You should totally go. Exclusions apply. Black Friday madness is over. But rest easy. Black Friday deals have been extended at Promenez-vous with the best offers on the best brands. Get any size of purple sheet sets and silk and snow relaxed linen sheets for the price of a twin. Plus, right now we pay both taxes on everything, including sheets, duvets, and more for a limited time only. Black Friday extended is on now at Promenez-vous. Don't miss it. Restrictions apply.
Volkswagen awaits at Remar Volkswagen, a family business for over 43 years. Thinking about financing, leasing, or trading in your Volkswagen? Choose Remar for complete satisfaction. Volkswagen is our business, and you are our priority.
5500 Metropolitan East. RemarVW.com. Entertaining for the holidays? Catering by Patisserie Dolce Sapore makes it easy. Enjoy the taste of Italian authentic flavors in everything they serve. Cakes and Christmas logs, amazing selection. Fresh breads, pizzas, and pastries, all baked in-house. Soup, salads, specialty products, and more. In a rush? You'll appreciate the lunchboxes and grab-and-go meals. They also have gift cards and gift baskets to please friends and family this festive season. Visit Patisserie Dolce Sapore in Laval, Mascouche, and RDP. PatisserieDolceSapore.com.
This weekend at Uniprix, get a $10 gift card with a purchase of $60 of almost anything in store. Come in quick. Some restrictions apply. Details in store. The beat gets you back to the music faster with all the big hits. Sit back and enjoy the time around the tree with your family. Happy holidays! Montreal's perfect holiday mix. The Beat 92.5.
with this kind of attraction or connection with somebody, but it's not entirely clear because he's saying, well, where did she come from? Was she blind? Was she, what was that about?
Lori becomes the lead actress in this new movie that Brian and Jimmy are making, and we inhabit her perspective. We get her point of view as well.
Right.
And I'm wondering, what made you want to switch characters in this way and show us the world through Lori's eyes?
Well, I've done it before. In Black Hole, I also had two narratives, two protagonists, a male and female, and I wanted to have two sides of the story, kind of adding some depth to the characters to show who they are, and seeing her perspectives of him and bouncing back and forth.
I think it's interesting specifically because Lori is this like central preoccupation for Brian and is this object of fascination. He doesn't objectify her in a way that felt super leering, but he is obviously, he's a teenage boy. He's like fantasizing about her. And I think that getting to inhabit her perspective for me, really as a reader, kind of takes me out of that objectifying position and gets to see like, well, this is a woman who also, you know, is changing from a girl into a woman. She's also an adolescent, figuring out her own desires. And we see this sort of classic adolescent plotline that I think most people go through in some way or another of she's the object of this guy's affection, her desires lie elsewhere.
Right.
Now, I don't want to give away too much plot, but there's this queer romance plotline for Lori that I didn't see coming, but I was really excited to see as a queer reader of the book. And I'm wondering what it was that you wanted to explore, including this queer relationship, particularly given that this is a book that's set in the early to mid 70s.
Right.
Very, very different time for somebody to be exploring that compared to like when I was coming out in the 2010s.
Well, again, the way that I write as I go, and the most interesting part about that is discovering things that you didn't anticipate. So originally, the very kind of skeletal structure of the story, Jimmy was going to be, you know, the kind of, oh, here's my best friend who gets the girl that I'm attracted to. And then I was working on it, I was just like, I don't know, I was like, do I need to go through that same typical scenario? And it sounds odd, but as you're working, sometimes there's just like a character who shows up and like, oh, what if these two are interested in each other? So there's a scene early in the story where they're at Jimmy's birthday party and they're looking at movies, and there's an interaction between the main protagonist, Brian, and Lori, and somewhere in the background, this girl is just kind of looking at Lori, and it was just an incidental background character, but somehow there was some thing that happened, like, oh, well, what if they're interested in each other, or what if they've had some romantic attraction to each other? So that just opened up another, just something much richer for me to think about and to look at.
If you're just tuning into the show, I'm here chatting with American cartoonist Charles Burns, and we're talking about his new book, Final Cut. I want to talk a little bit now, Charles, about the graphic style of Final Cut, because it is stunning and it's so immersive and it has this almost pop art feel to it for me. You're known for a really sharp and high contrast style. There's like heavy shadows, there's a film noir vibe to a lot of your work. But what's different with this book compared to some of your earlier work is there's an expansive color palette with like deep reds and purples and really bright teal. And we also see some beautiful natural tones of landscape. A lot of the scenes take place with the characters hiking and camping. Can you chat a little bit about your use of color and what you wanted to evoke in this book with the color?
When I was starting out as a cartoonist, I looked at a lot of black and white work, and I admired a lot of black and white comic work. And that had to do, in some cases, with the limitation of printing, of what was cost-effective. Printing in color back in the day was very hard. So I kind of trained myself, and at the same time was always attracted to a certain style of this very strong black and white work. But eventually I reached this point where I had access to doing full color artwork, and for me that opened up all kinds of possibilities. For example, the main character in Final Cut has red hair, so if you're seeing her from behind or seeing her from a distance, you immediately know, oh, she's the one that's got red hair. So I tend to do, most of my characters look very similar. That's kind of a cartooning thing I do, but there's elements in using color that are great devices for storytelling. And I think in this most recent book, I've kind of expanded some of the things I'm doing, like really thinking about color in a different way.
Mhm. I want to ask a little bit more about how you found your way into comics and why this is the art form that you've chosen to work in for your whole life. I understand you were interested in drawing and art from a very early age. Was that something that was encouraged within your family growing up? Like, where did you get
Oh,
this interest?
Yeah, it wasn't discouraged, and I think that both my parents, we had a lot of books around the house. We went to the library every single week and had stacks of books. And my father especially was interested in art, and sculpture, and illustration, and comics, which was very unusual, especially the late 50s and early 60s. So there were books around the house that I would just pick up and look at, and somehow internalize some of those very strong images at a very early age before I was actually reading. And also, I have an older sister who's like 3.5 years older than me. So my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and my sister was off at school. So for about 3 years there or so, I was just like hanging out with my mom, who was an only child and didn't know about play dates and socializing her sons. Like, so I was just hanging out by myself in this house and looking at books. And I'd say, tell my mom that I was bored. So, sit down and help, here's some paper. Keep yourself busy with doing drawing. And I think early on, I was like copying things, like copying a book cover. And I remember one day, a very specific moment of just like, I think as a child, you can usually tell like a genuine adult response. And I remember I had done some drawing that was copying these knights in armor or something like that. And then just seeing this guy like, oh, this is really good. And not just kind of trying to pat you on the head. And so obviously you think about any response like that, like, oh, I want more of that. And so that was just like the kind of very early core memory of like, I enjoyed drawing, but I also had a response.
Yeah, hearing you talk about like getting this validation and that being so important because it's so true. I think that often adults want to encourage kids and they think that kids are not as emotionally attuned as they really are.
Right.
Whereas kids are probably, if there's one thing they're good at, it is emotional attunement, right?
Right.
And sensing when someone is sincere. And also interesting that you pointed out it was a bit unusual that you had parents that were like into comics. It was something that was not necessarily like the most top respected art form at the time.
We moved around quite a bit, but I felt like I got settled like probably at the end of grade school in Seattle. And just the friends that I made around there was no one who was interested in comics and that sort of thing. And it was very clear to me that hearing references from my friends' parents and things like that, that it was still had this kind of stigma attached to it. It's like, okay, this is something you might be able to read it, but then you throw it in the garbage. It's not something you're going to hang on to or consider important. But in my house, it wasn't something that was encouraged, but it wasn't discouraged either. And so I tried to stay under the radar. I just behaved myself as much as I needed to, just so I could walk down to the woods and smoke a joint and come back and draw stoner drawings in my bedroom.
That's not bad, if you can get away with that as a kid, you're
I got away with it most of the time, not every time, but yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask a little bit about your early career because it's interesting. Yeah, comics were for a long time seen as something where it's like they're cheap. It's often superhero stuff,
Right.
kids stuff that was not taken seriously as an art form. And when you were first starting out in your career in the early 1980s, we didn't have quite the same culture around graphic novels
Right, yeah,
being
not at
seen as
all.
this like serious art form, and you struggled a bit to find a place in the comic scene, from what I understand.
Mhm.
And a lot of your early work was in Raw magazine that was being published in New York by Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly. What was the impact of that era and Raw magazine on you and your career?
Well, after I graduated from high school, I went to art school, and I just had this very vague idea of like I've always drawn. I like comics, but I saw myself as an artist. So I did painting and printmaking and did a whole lot of tried a whole lot of different things. But I was always doing like kind of my comic work on the side, and I'd never met another cartoonist, a professional cartoonist. And it's a long story, but eventually I got to meet Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly, and I had seen the very first issue of Raw on the stands in New York City because I was up there trying to show my portfolio around, and I kind of instantly thought, oh, this is this kind of publication that I always imagined. This kind of oversized, beautifully printed, and there's this kind of oddball, intense graphics, this graphic quality. And initially, Art serialized his book Mouse in little pamphlets in the magazine. So anyway, Art was the first person I met, and he was a great person to meet because he had just an incredible knowledge of the history of comics, and he was the first person who really looked at that side of my work very seriously. And I think one of the first times we sat down and talked, and I brought up a whole stack of drawings, and there was one page that was kind of a series of abstract images, interrelated images, and he was just looking silently for a long time. I started getting nervous, like, oh, I started trying to kind of point out, explain what this thing was about. I'm like, no, 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 that's against the rules. I thought, oh, I get it. He's just looking at it very carefully. He's taking it seriously. And so, in a way, we're talking about validation. That was a certain amount of validation for me as well. And we're still close friends after all these years. And he was incredibly helpful and generous in that I would visit regularly, and it's like, oh, do you know so and so? And like, no, I've never heard of that. He had kind of access to all these exotic European authors that I'd never heard of, and stacks of books, and it was this incredible education for me just to be suddenly meeting other artists, talking with him for hours on end. So yeah, that was really kind of the starting point of finding my way into getting my comics published.
That's so cool to hear about, because I think for me, as for so many people, Art Spiegelman was my entry point into
Yeah,
the world
for
of
so many people.
comics, graphic novels. As you said, like he wrote Mouse. It was like got a special Pulitzer because they didn't even know at that point like how to categorize the work. They were like, this is serious, like journalistic almost reporting, but also art, but also comic. What do we do?
Yeah.
And then Françoise Mounier has been the art editor at the New Yorker for years.
Yeah.
And I think that this sort of common thread between the work that they've done and your work, and really this like world of comics that sort of developed through people that were getting published in Raw in the 80s, is there's this like dark sensibility and ability to grapple with very deep, sometimes sinister subject matter. Your work in particular has a like dystopian and surreal vibe a lot of the time. If I look back at like Black Hole, for instance, there's definitely like an eeriness to it. Final Cut, I would say, has a lot of that dread, teenage angst, surrealism, particularly in the dream sequence, but it's also very grounded in real life and real teenage problems. And there's a bit of like a hope and redemption vibe towards the end of the story. It doesn't end on a particularly dour note. Brian is in an interesting place at the end of Final Cut, I would say, where he, a bit being stymied in some of his artistic and romantic pursuits, a little bit disappointed and frustrated, but he also has this ability to kind of write his own narrative, that he has this amazing imagination. He has clearly a lot of artistic inspiration that he's drawing from some of these experiences that are difficult. And that gives him a bit of an ability to control his own story and exert some agency, which is something that teenagers often are lacking.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what art can offer people that are maybe experiencing these kinds of personal, professional, romantic, whatever frustrations.
For me, it's always just this kind of odd urge to tell this story. I can't explain it in any other way. I'm never thinking of an audience. I mean, obviously you're working for print and you anticipate that there's a book that's going to come out or some kind of publication. But for me, the urge is always, it's not therapeutic. It's some inexplicable thing I can't quite put into words. It's this urge to tell that story or it's formulating ideas as you're working. And I've never believed in the idea that if you kind of express these things and you get it out of your system, they're obviously still in my system. But yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot in there. The idea that you're talking about, that there's just this like drive and this engine that I think a lot of creative people have, where it sounds like you're the sort of person, and the character Brian in Final Cut is the sort of person that would want to make art even if there was no one to see it. Like there was just a need to tell these stories and a need to express.
Yeah, I would definitely be doing something, whether it was going down to my little local print shop and printing up some Xerox copies of my comics or something, yeah, I would find something. I feel I've been incredibly lucky to find an audience that's interested in my work, but there's something that happens when I'm sitting at a table and every once in a while it's just like, oh, this is working and there's something that's happening there that is, I can't explain it, but it's like feeding back to you. Something is feeding you something that's strong, and that's what I'm kind of still chasing after, that feeling of like, oh, discovery. You discover something new.
That's so beautiful to hear that that's still a feeling that you can
Oh,
get
yeah.
after having, a long career in so many different phases of it. Charles, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you, and I myself have been trying to get more into an artistic and creative practice that's not my job, and I think hearing you talk about this process and the drive to create and just to sit down at the table and let things flow, it makes me want to go home and write in my journal.
Oh, good. I mean, that happens to me as well. Every once in a while, there'll be like something that inspires you. Like, I need to go home and work. So, yeah, I appreciate your close read on my final cut. I enjoyed your questions, so thanks.
Thanks so much. That was my conversation with Charles Burns about his graphic novel Final Cut. This week's show was produced by Ryan B. Patrick and Katie Swales, with help from Ailey Yamamoto, Barb Carey, and Lisa Matthews. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our audio techs and the rest of the CBC Books team for everything they do to make this show happen. I'm Matea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.
This is CBC Radio 1, 88.5 FM in Montreal. Breaking news happens anywhere, anytime.
Police are warned the protesters repeatedly get back.
CBC News brings the story to you as it happens.
Hundreds of wildfires are burning.
Be the first to know what's going on and what that means for you and for Canadians.
The situation has changed very quickly.
Helping make sense of the world when it matters most. Stay in the know. CBC News. The CBC News is next, and then it's Unreserved with Rosanna Deerchild.
Many will know him as the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was a lawyer, a judge, a senator, but he was also a dedicated family man. Today, a tribute to the late Murray Sinclair.
From CBC News, The World This Hour, I'm Martina Fitzgerald. It is a seismic moment for Syria and for the Middle East. Rebel forces have seized control of the capital, Damascus, ending the repressive 50-year rule of the al-Assad family. This was a scene in Damascus as fighters and civilians celebrated Assad's overthrow. It is a stunning development in a brutal and bloody civil war stretching almost 14 years. The streets are now much quieter, with the rebels declaring a curfew until just before dawn tomorrow. Assad is believed to have fled, but his whereabouts are unknown. Reports from Moscow quote a Kremlin source as saying Assad and his family have been given asylum in Russia. Images have surfaced of Syrians ransacking his vacant presidential palace in Damascus, some seen leaving carrying furniture and dishes. Justin Trudeau commented this past hour, saying a new chapter for Syria can begin, free of terrorism and suffering. The Prime Minister added that Canada is closely watching the transition, urging order, stability, and respect for human rights. And just minutes ago, U.S. President Joe Biden offered his reaction, saying in the end, neither Russia, Hezbollah, nor Iran could save the Assad regime.
At long last,
the Assad regime's fall. This regime brutalized and tortured and killed literally hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians. The fall of the regime is a fundamental act of justice, a moment of historic opportunity for long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their proud country. It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty.
Biden says the U.S. will work with its allies in Syria and the Middle East to manage that risk. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the future of Syria is up to Syrians to decide, adding Special Envoy Geir Pedersen will be working with them. Guterres is urging Syrians to remain calm and avoid violence during the transition. Donald Trump has given his first network TV interview since winning the U.S. election. Speaking with NBC's Meet the Press, the U.S. president-elect said during his 4 years in office, he will deport all illegal migrants. Trump also said he would consider pulling out of NATO, and he talked about border issues with Canada.
I spoke with Justin Trudeau. In fact, he flew to Mar-a-Lago within about 15 seconds after the call.
Yeah.
He was at Mar-a-Lago. We were having dinner talking about it. I said, you have to close up your borders because they're coming in the northern border too a lot. Not like the southern border, but they're coming in the Canadian border a lot. And drugs are pouring in. Almost as importantly, drugs are pouring in, maybe more importantly.
Trump said he would follow through on a campaign promise to levy tariffs on imports from America's biggest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. He said tariffs would make the U.S. richer. When asked if he could guarantee that his plan would not see American families pay more, Trump said he can't guarantee anything. With the holidays just ahead, there are more parcels than usual being dropped at front doors. Police in St. John say this time of year they see an uptick in reports of packages stolen after delivery. Constable James Cadigan has these tips for keeping deliveries safe.
The apps that come with a lot of doorbell cameras will notify you. You'll get a notification on your phone. So if you got a way to get home or have somebody stop by and grab your package so that it's not sitting there for too long. If you're going to be at work in the daytime when most of these packages are being delivered, it's an idea, of course, to have delivered to your workplace or some place that, somebody will be, whether it's a family member or a neighbor.
Cadigan says thieves are not just hoping to spot opportunities. They follow delivery vans with the intention of stealing packages. And that is your World this hour. For CBC News, I'm Martina Fitzgerald.
Here's your weather forecast for Quebec and Montreal, Laval. A 60% chance of rain showers or flurries this afternoon. Wind gusting to 40 and a high of 2 degrees. Clearing this evening and a low of -9. In the townships, about 2 to 4 centimeters of snow today and a high of 1. A chance of flurries this evening, clearing before morning and a low of -14. Quebec City today, about 5 centimeters of snow. Wind gusting to 40, a high of -4. Wind chill -11 this afternoon, a low of -16 overnight.
So I started writing her letters. I wrote it every day. Then after a while, they actually became stories about our interchanges where she would come and visit me, and then I would record afterwards or write down afterwards what it was that we had done, the things we had shared. And I used to call them letters to my Sarah.
One of the last gifts left to us by the late Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair is his memoir. And it was the love for his granddaughter that made it possible.
When my granddaughter, Marisha and Vance, were born, just before that, about a year before that, I had suffered a minor stroke. And I remember thinking that I may not be around when she grows up. I may not be around to give her the advice that Moshe needs to give to his granddaughter. She may have questions that only I can answer. She doesn't know about my family. She doesn't know about my grandmother, my grandfather. And so I thought, I'm going to start writing things down for her.
Those letters would go on to encapsulate 4 questions. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? Who am I?
I realized this book is a gift to me, but also a gift to Canada, not just Indigenous peoples, but to non-Indigenous peoples too, for us to learn. It's really something that he gave me, and then now it's to the nation.
Hello and welcome. This is Unreserved. I'm Rosanna Dearchild. The late Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair had many roles. To Sarah Fontaine Sinclair, he was a musha, a storyteller, a teacher, and someone who dressed up as Shrek at Halloween.
He showed us, especially the younger people in our family, how to be really beautiful and powerful leaders. He always taught us that through a lot of humor.
Sarah guides us in a tribute to one of the most significant Indigenous leaders of our time, through the eyes of a granddaughter. Plus, Stephanie Scott worked alongside Murray during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
For those that have seen him as this iconic figure in Canada and the world, he's also very human. And although he had his traditions and support, there were tears.
And the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry was a moment of hard truth for Murray and for Manitoba. Chief Justice Glenn Doyle says it set into motion this country's path to reconciliation.
First of all, if there wasn't Murray Sinclair, there might not have been an AJI. If there wasn't an AJI, there might not have been a TRC. If there wasn't a TRC, there might not have been an inquiry into missing murdered women and girls.
The Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair passed on November 4th of this year at the age of 73. Today, we remember and honor the legacy of Mazina Giza-Kidan.
He was just a kid, quite late, one trying to check the car doors to see if they were unlocked or robbing someone.
That's Murray Sinclair, or Mazina Giza-Kidan, reading from his memoir, Who We Are, 4 Questions for a Life and a Nation. One day, he was almost robbed by a kid who a few weeks earlier had stood in his courtroom. He had been arrested after running away from his foster home.
I didn't expect to see him again, but there he was.
It was 1988. Murray was just appointed Associate Chief Judge of the Manitoba Provincial Court, only the second Indigenous person to be appointed to the bench in Canada, and the first in Manitoba. In his memoir, Murray writes that the would-be robber ended up in a hotel room. Alone and hungry, the boy waited for his social worker to drop off some money for food. It was almost late, so he went looking for money elsewhere. He found Murray.
Ask me more of it. I said, what? Ask me to lend you $10, I repeated. I can't pay you back. Don't worry about that. Ask me. Can I borrow $10? I dug in my pocket and took out what I had. Here's 40. How will I pay you back? Don't worry about it. Just promise me you'll try to stay out of trouble.
Murray asked the young man for one more thing: go back to school. Education got us into this mess, and education will get us out of it. It was one of Murray's most well-known sayings. He fiercely believed that education was the key for Indigenous people to change their lives, and for non-Indigenous people to change their minds. But he recognized that for those who suffered trauma in residential schools, education was a challenge. And so was educating Canada about those difficult truths. Nonetheless, Murray dedicated his life to that challenge, for future generations, and for a scared kid who tried to rob him.
I hope that young man made it. He deserved to. And if he did, I'm glad I had a small hand in it. I hope he knows that the gift he gave me was a beautiful one, because that young man could have also been me.
Murray Sinclair shared many such stories in his memoir, stories that offer lessons that started out as letters to his granddaughter, Sarah Fontaine Sinclair. Now a music student at the University of Ottawa, Sarah grew up listening to her musha tell her stories about life, ceremony, and family. But she also remembers a musha who loved rock and roll, motorcycles, and bad dad jokes. Sarah, welcome to Unreserved.
Thank Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. It's an honor. And please let me just start by extending our entire team's condolences for your loss.
Thank you.
Just know that all of Indian country is there with you, sharing in your grief.
Thank you.
Now, never have I ever started an interview this way, but I understand your Musham loves sharing knock-knock jokes.
Yes. I was looking through some of our texts the other day, and almost all of our conversations either had to do with him teasing me about music or him sending me knock-knock jokes. It was like a daily thing that he would send me.
Can you share your best worst one?
Yes, I have some on my phone. He loved elephant ones. Those were his favorite because he loved elephants so much. And one of my favorites was, where does an elephant keep his spare tire?
Where?
In their trunk.
Ah, groaner.
I know.
Those are really good dad jokes. How did this routine of sending knock-knock jokes and terrible dad jokes begin?